In the spring of 1898, undertaker Samuel Pritchard purchased 12 coffins from a widow in rural Arkansas. They were beautiful caskets, mahogany with brass fixtures, worth far more than the pittance she was asking. He couldn't believe his luck. That night, as he stacked them in his funeral parlor, he noticed something odd. The coffins were heavy. Far too heavy to be empty. When he pried open the first lid, the scream that tore from his throat woke half the town. Inside lay a man, perfectly preserved, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. His mouth was twisted in a silent scream, and his fingers were bloody stumps, nails torn away from clawing at the satin lining. Samuel opened another coffin. Then another. All 12 contained bodies. And all 12 showed the same desperate signs: they had been buried alive. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our terrifying true stories. Now, let's continue with this horrifying tale. Chapter 1, The Widow's Offer. The letter arrived at Samuel Pritchard's funeral parlor on a cold Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy who vanished before Samuel could reply. Written in an elegant but trembling hand, it read: Dear Mr. Pritchard, I am a widow living alone outside Ashford. My late husband was a coffin maker, and I must sell his remaining stock, 12 coffins of the finest craftsmanship, for $20. If interested, please visit the Holloway property on Raven Creek Road. Yours in sorrow, Mrs. Abigail Holloway. $20 for 12 mahogany coffins. Samuel read the note 3 times. Such work sold for at least $30 each. It was either a miracle or a mistake, and either way, worth investigating. The next morning, Samuel set off toward Raven Creek Road. A ghostly mist clung to the ground, and the deeper he drove into the pine forest, the quieter the world became. No birdsong, no rustling, only the creak of his wagon and the rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves. The trees were old and twisted, forming shapes that felt intentional. Once or twice he thought he saw movement among them, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The Holloway house appeared suddenly, swallowed by forest. Once white, now it was a skeleton of weathered wood. The porch sagged, curtains were drawn, and behind it a barn, larger than the house, was locked with a heavy chain. Before Samuel could knock, the door opened. Mr. Pritchard, whispered a gaunt woman in black. You came. I wasn't sure. Mrs. Holloway, I presume. 12 coffins for $20 seems unusually generous. A flicker of something, fear, guilt, crossed her face. I need them gone. My husband died 6 months ago, and I cannot bear to look at his work. Every coffin reminds me of him, of what he did. She caught herself. What he made, I mean. She handed him a cold iron key. They're in the barn. I haven't opened it since the funeral. And, don't open them. They're sealed to preserve the wood. Opening them voids their integrity. It was an odd warning, but Samuel nodded and approached the barn. The new padlock contrasted with the rotting wood. When he turned the key, the lock clicked open too easily. The heavy doors swung wide as if pushed by unseen hands. A wave of scent rolled out, varnish and sawdust beneath something organic and wrong. Inside, 12 coffins stood in 2 perfect rows. Even in the dim light they gleamed, brass polished to a shine. Holloway had been a master craftsman. Yet something about them unsettled Samuel. They seemed to absorb light, and the air grew colder between them. And then there was the smell, stronger now, crawling into his throat. He examined them one by one. Each was flawless, too flawless. But as he circled back toward the first row, a detail caught his eye, a small brass plate near the head of each coffin. These weren't blank. They were engraved. Thomas Whitley, born 1853. Margaret Sweeney, born 1862. Robert Chen, born 1844. All 12 bore names. All 12 listed only birth years. Samuel's stomach turned. These weren't generic coffins. They had been made for specific people, people who, as far as those engravings suggested, might still be alive. The widow's warning echoed in his head, don't open them. Suddenly, $20 felt less like a bargain and more like hush money. He considered leaving. But he was an undertaker, not a detective. The coffins themselves were just wood and brass. Whatever story they held was not his business. He placed $20 in gold coins on the kitchen table. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, eyes hollow. "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. You've lifted a great burden." "They have names," he said quietly. "My husband was sentimental. He liked to imagine who might rest in them," she replied, the words too rehearsed. Samuel thought to press her, but the grief, or terror, in her eyes stopped him. "I'll send men to collect them tomorrow." No, the word cracked from her throat. "Take them now. Please. I need them gone today." And so he did. Together they loaded 12 heavy coffins onto his wagon. Despite her frail frame, she worked with frantic strength, never speaking, never meeting his gaze. When the last coffin was secured, she vanished back into the house without a word. Samuel drove away quickly, eager to escape the suffocating silence of the forest, and the weight of the 12 names now riding behind him. Chapter 2: The Weight of Suspicion. The journey back to town took longer than expected. Though empty, the coffins weighed down the wagon, forcing Samuel's horse to slow. Each time he stopped to rest, his eyes drifted to the cargo behind him, 12 flawless caskets that felt wrong in a way he couldn't name. As the sun set and the forest darkened, a new detail unsettled him: the coffins were warm. Not from sunlight, most were shaded, but warm like living flesh, radiating heat from within. He touched another. Same warmth. It had to be his imagination. Even so, Samuel climbed to the front of the wagon, putting as much distance between himself and them as possible. It was past 8 when he reached his funeral parlor. The street outside buzzed with evening activity, and the sounds of ordinary life were comforting after the Holloway property's eerie silence. Samuel backed the wagon to the side door and began unloading the coffins. They were heavier than he remembered, and by the 6th, exhaustion forced him to stop. He locked the door and lit a lamp to inspect the ones he'd brought inside. The craftsmanship was extraordinary: polished mahogany, seamless joints, satin-lined interiors. But the nameplates again drew his attention: Thomas Whitley, Margaret Sweeney, Robert Chen, Sarah Morrison. None of them appeared in his death records, not even in entries from a decade past. Either they hadn't died, or something far darker had happened. He tried to shake the thought. He was tired, unsettled by the long journey and that suffocating house. These were just coffins, a bargain, nothing more. He extinguished the lamp and climbed the stairs to his living quarters. Yet when he glanced back, the coffins seemed to emit a faint inner glow. A trick of tired eyes, he told himself. Sleep did not come easily. Samuel's dreams were fragmented and sinister: trees shifting with purpose, Mrs. Holloway's hands soaked in blood, coffins opening one by one. He woke gasping before seeing what was inside. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound from downstairs. Wood against wood. Candle in hand, Samuel descended, retrieving the revolver he kept for emergencies. The scraping ceased, but something urged him onward. The preparation room door creaked as he pushed it open. The 6 coffins stood where he'd left them. Nothing seemed disturbed, until he noticed one detail. The lid of Thomas Whitley's coffin wasn't flush. A thin, dark gap, no more than a quarter inch, ran along the edge. Samuel's breath caught. He'd inspected these coffins meticulously, they had been sealed tight. Now, the wood beneath his trembling fingers felt hot, too hot. Then the gap widened, almost imperceptibly. The lid shifted upward by a fraction. And from inside came a sound that froze his blood, a faint, desperate scratching, like fingernails clawing at satin. Samuel stumbled backward, candlelight shaking. The scratching continued, now joined by a low, muffled moan, or perhaps the settling of wood. He wanted to flee, to leave the building and never return. But his feet were rooted in place, eyes locked on the coffin. And then it stopped. The lid settled back into place with a soft click, seamless once more. Silence reclaimed the room. Samuel stood frozen for minutes, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Slowly, his rational mind fought back. Perhaps the wood was adjusting. New coffins sometimes made sounds as they acclimated to their environment. Perhaps the heat was from his hands, the gap always there, hidden by shadow. But how did he explain the scratching? He couldn't. Samuel backed out of the room and locked the door behind him. Upstairs, he didn't sleep again. He sat by the window, revolver in hand, watching the quiet street below as the night crawled past. And as dawn broke over Ashford, one thought consumed him, a decision he knew he had to make. He would open one of the coffins. Chapter 3, The Discovery. Samuel waited until mid-morning to open the coffin. He told himself he was waiting for proper daylight, for the courage that comes with sunshine and the sounds of town life outside his windows. But the truth was simpler, he was terrified of what he might find. His assistant, young Marcus Webb, arrived at 9 o'clock as usual, whistling a tune that died on his lips when he saw Samuel's face. "Mr. Pritchard?" "Sir, are you unwell? You look as if you haven't slept." "I haven't, Marcus. I need you to help me with something. It's irregular." Samuel led the young man to the preparation room and showed him the 6 coffins. Marcus's eyes widened with appreciation at the craftsmanship. "Beautiful work, sir. Where did you get them?" "From a widow. The Holloway property, out on Raven Creek Road. Her husband was a carpenter." "Marcus, I need to open one of them." The young man's brow furrowed. "Open it? But why?" "They're new coffins, sir. Sealed and ready for use." Samuel wasn't sure how to explain his fears without sounding insane. "Quality control," he said finally. "I need to inspect the interior construction. Make sure they're sound before I sell them." It was a weak excuse, but Marcus accepted it without question. Together, they selected the nearest coffin, Thomas Whitley's, and laid it on the preparation table. Samuel retrieved his pry bar, the tool he used to open coffins for family members who wanted one last viewing of the deceased. His hands shook as he positioned the bar under the lid. "Sir, are you certain about this? If these are as well made as they appear, opening them might damage." "Just help me, Marcus." They worked in silence, applying pressure to the lid. The seal was strong, much stronger than it should be for a new coffin. Samuel had to use all his strength, and still the lid barely budged. After several minutes of effort, they heard a crack as the seal finally broke. A smell escaped from the gap they'd created, not the smell of fresh wood and varnish, but something organic and sickly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. "Good Lord," Marcus muttered, covering his nose. "What is that smell?" Samuel didn't answer. He was too focused on prying the lid open. With one final effort, it gave way with a splintering sound, and they lifted it free. For a moment, neither man could process what they were seeing. Then Marcus screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror, and stumbled backward, crashing into the wall. Inside the coffin lay a man. Not a skeleton, not a corpse in any ordinary sense, but a body that looked as if it had been dead for mere hours. The skin was pale but intact, the features recognizable. He was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair and a mustache, dressed in ordinary work clothes, denim trousers and a cotton shirt. But his eyes were open, staring upward with an expression of indescribable horror. His mouth was frozen in a scream, lips drawn back from his teeth. And his hands. His hands were the worst part. The fingers were bloody and torn, nails ripped away completely, leaving raw, exposed flesh. The satin lining of the coffin interior showed deep gouges where he'd clawed desperately at it. On the underside of the lid, barely visible, were dozens of scratch marks and what looked like words, scratched frantically with bleeding fingertips, "Help me," carved again and again in shaky letters. Samuel felt his stomach heave. He turned away and vomited into a bucket in the corner. Marcus was sliding down the wall, hyperventilating, his face white as chalk. The preparation room seemed to spin around them, and for a moment Samuel thought he might faint. But he forced himself to breathe, to think, to function. Marcus. Marcus, look at me. The young man's eyes were glazed with shock. We need to call the sheriff. Right now. Can you do that? Can you go to the sheriff's office? Marcus nodded mutely, still staring at the open coffin. Samuel had to physically turn him away and push him toward the door before the young man seemed to come back to himself. He stumbled out of the room, and Samuel heard his footsteps running up the stairs and out the front entrance. Alone with the body, Samuel forced himself to look again. The corpse, because that's what it was, despite its impossible freshness, showed clear signs of having been buried alive. The man had suffocated or died of terror, trapped in darkness, unable to escape. The expression on his face told the story of his final moments: panic, desperation, the slow realization that no help was coming. Samuel looked at the brass nameplate. Thomas Whitley, born 1853. Was this Thomas Whitley? And if it was, how long had he been in this coffin? The body looked fresh, but the scratches on the lid and lining suggested hours of desperate struggle. How was any of this possible? His eyes moved to the other 5 coffins lined against the wall. If this one contained a body, then they all did. 5 more victims. 5 more people buried alive in these beautiful, damnable boxes. And there were 6 more still in his wagon outside. 12 in total. 12 people who died in terror and agony. Samuel's mind reeled with questions. How had Holloway done this? Why? And Mrs. Holloway, what was her role? Had she known? Had she helped? Was that why she'd been so desperate to be rid of the coffins, why she'd sold them for such a pittance? The front door burst open, and heavy footsteps pounded through the building. Sheriff Tom Hendricks entered the preparation room with Marcus close behind, along with 2 deputies. Hendricks was a large man with a weather-beaten face and cold blue eyes that had seen more than their share of violence. But even he stopped short when he saw the open coffin. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "Is that a body, Sheriff? Buried alive, from the looks of it." Samuel's voice was surprisingly steady. He pointed to the other coffins. "There are 5 more in this room, and 6 more in my wagon outside. All purchased yesterday from Mrs. Abigail Holloway of the Raven Creek property. Her late husband made them." Hendricks approached the coffin slowly, his face hardening into a professional mask. He examined the body without touching it, noting the torn fingers, the scratched messages, the expression of terror. "I know this man," he said quietly. "Thomas Whitley. Went missing about 4 months ago. Traveled through Ashford on his way to Little Rock. Never arrived. We assumed bandits got him on the road. The nameplate says 1853. Is that his birth year? Could be. Age seems about right." Hendricks turned to his deputies. "Open the others. All of them. I need to see what we're dealing with." For the next hour, the preparation room became a scene of macabre discovery. One by one, the coffins were opened. Each contained a body. Each showed the same signs: fresh appearance despite months of confinement, evidence of being buried alive, hands torn from clawing at the lining, desperate messages scratched into the wood. Margaret Sweeney, Robert Chen, Daniel Thorne, Sarah Morrison, James Reed, all names that matched missing persons from the past year. People who'd passed through Ashford or lived in outlying areas. People who'd vanished without a trace. The wagon outside yielded 6 more horrors. By the time they finished, 12 bodies lay in Samuel's preparation room and workshop, 12 faces frozen in their final terror. Sheriff Hendricks stood among them, his expression grim. "This is the work of a serial killer," he said. "Multiple victims over an extended period." Chapter 4: The Return to Raven Creek. Sheriff Hendricks assembled a posse of 6 men to ride to the Holloway property. Samuel insisted on going with them. "This is my responsibility," he said. "I brought those coffins into town. I have to see this through." They left at noon under a heavy sky. The forest was darker and quieter than before, branches weaving together to block out the light. the horses grew restless, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something watched them from the shadows. The Holloway house appeared like a ghost out of the gloom, and this time, it was on fire. Black smoke poured from the windows, flames devouring the second floor. The men rushed forward, but the blaze was too advanced. At Hendricks's command, 2 deputies checked the barn. Inside, they found Mrs. Holloway, or what was left of her. She was dead, throat slit before the fire began. "This wasn't suicide," Hendricks said grimly. "Someone killed her and burned the house to hide it." The search revealed worse horrors. Beneath the barn floor, they uncovered a pit filled with human remains, dozens of skeletons and fresher corpses with torn fingernails and terror frozen on their faces. Some were children. "He didn't just kill 12, Samuel whispered. "He killed dozens." Inside the charred house, they found Holloway's journals, 15 years of meticulous records, detailing every victim, every method, every burial. In the barn, a locked cabinet held photographs, victims bound and gagged, sealed in coffins with tiny windows, their faces contorted in agony. And in every picture, Mrs. Holloway appeared, sometimes watching, sometimes smiling. She hadn't been a bystander. She had participated. The final horror waited in a small cemetery hidden in the undergrowth, 12 wooden crosses bearing the names from the coffins. But the dates were all wrong. Thomas Whitley, 1897. Margaret Sweeney, 1896. All long dead, and yet Samuel had seen their bodies, fresh and recent. "We have to dig one up," Samuel urged. Hendricks hesitated, then agreed to exhume a single grave. They chose Thomas Whitley's. When the coffin was unearthed and pried open, it was empty, except for the words "Help me" carved frantically into the lid. Samuel's mind raced. What if he found a way to keep them alive? To trap them between life and death? "Impossible," Hendricks muttered, though his voice betrayed doubt. Rain began to fall, dousing the fire but not their dread. Hendricks made the call: they'd leave, secure the bodies, and return with reinforcements. But as they rode away, Samuel thought he saw a man, tall, in work clothes, watching from the barn door. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Night had fallen by the time they reached Ashford. But when they entered the funeral parlor, they froze. The coffins were open, and empty. Every body had vanished. A trail of wet footprints led from the coffins to the back door, then out into the storm. "They're going home," Samuel whispered. "Back to the Holloway property." "Impossible," Hendricks said. "Dead men don't walk." "Then explain this." The posse followed the muddy tracks into the alley and toward the forest. They stretched on for miles, fading into darkness and rain. Eventually, the trail vanished completely. Hendricks ordered them to stop. "We return at dawn. With more men. Properly armed." Back in town, no one slept. Samuel stared out his window through the night, haunted by the images burned into his mind: the pit of bones, Mrs. Holloway's twisted smile, the empty coffins. And the footprints, 12 sets, walking into the woods. When dawn broke gray and cold, Samuel knew what he had to do. He would return to Raven Creek. He would follow those tracks. Because whatever evil had taken root there was not finished, and now, neither was he. Chapter 5, The Truth in the Journals. Sheriff Hendricks spent the night reading Holloway's journals by lamplight in his office. What he found was more disturbing than any crime scene he'd ever investigated. The journals revealed a man utterly obsessed with death, not with killing, precisely, but with the moment of death itself, with the transition from life to something else. The early entries, from 1883, showed Holloway as a normal carpenter with a morbid curiosity. He built coffins for the local undertaker and spent too much time thinking about what happened to consciousness at the moment of death. Where did it go? Did it linger in the body? Could it be trapped, preserved, studied? His obsession deepened after his mother's death in 1885. He wrote about sitting with her corpse for 3 days, convinced she was still present somehow, still aware. He built her a special coffin with a viewing window and laid her to rest in the family cemetery behind his house. But he couldn't leave her alone. Night after night, he went to the grave and dug her up, staring through the window at her decaying face, looking for some sign of consciousness. Then, in 1887, came the breakthrough. Holloway met a traveling scholar. The journal didn't give a name, only referred to him as the professor, who claimed to have discovered an ancient alchemical formula. Not for immortality, but for something else, a state of suspension between life and death. The formula, when administered to a living person, would stop the decay process and trap the consciousness in the body indefinitely. The person wouldn't be alive, but they wouldn't be truly dead either. They would be aware, conscious, trapped in their own corpse for eternity. Holloway was fascinated. He begged the professor to teach him the formula. The journal entries grew frantic, obsessive. He wrote about the philosophical implications, the religious ramifications. If consciousness could be trapped in the body after death, what did that mean for the soul? For the afterlife? For God? The professor finally agreed to teach him, but at a price. Holloway had to prove his dedication by providing a test subject. The journal entry for September 15, 1887 was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. Today I selected my first subject. A drifter passing through town, no family, no ties. I befriended him, offered him work and lodging. Tonight I will administer the formula and seal him in a coffin. The professor assures me the process is irreversible. Once trapped, the consciousness cannot escape, cannot communicate except through the most rudimentary movements. The subject will experience an eternity of darkness, isolation, and silent screaming. This is the ultimate horror, the professor says. This is the fate worse than death. The next entry, dated a week later, was triumphant. It works. The formula works exactly as promised. The subject shows no signs of physical decay even after 7 days. When I open the viewing window, I can see his eyes moving, tracking me. He's aware. He's conscious. He's trapped. The professor was right, this is the ultimate power over life and death. I have become a god. From there, the journals descended into madness. Holloway began kidnapping people, always drifters, travelers, people who wouldn't be missed. He'd drug them, administer the formula, then seal them in coffins while they were still conscious. He'd bury them in his cemetery and visit them regularly, opening the viewing windows to watch their eyes, to see the awareness and horror trapped inside. But he wasn't satisfied with just watching. He wanted to document everything. So he married Abigail, a woman who shared his morbid curiosities, and together they refined the process. They built more elaborate coffins with better viewing windows. They took photographs at every stage. They even experimented with keeping subjects in the coffins for years, digging them up periodically to verify that the consciousness remained trapped. The journal entries revealed the fate of the 12 bodies Samuel had purchased. They were Holloway's most recent victims, killed in the last year of his life. But they weren't the only ones. The journals mention dozens of others, all buried in the cemetery, all still conscious, all trapped in their own decomposing corpses for years or even decades. The beautiful thing about the formula, Holloway wrote in 1893, is that it doesn't stop physical decay, it simply slows it and prevents death. The subjects remain aware even as their bodies slowly deteriorate around them. They feel everything. The liquefaction of organs. The consumption by insects. The slow collapse of flesh into bone. It's a process that can take 10, 20, even 30 years. And through it all, they're screaming silently in the darkness. Hendricks felt sick reading it. The implications were horrifying. If the formula really worked as described, then everyone buried in that cemetery was still conscious, still aware, still suffering. And now 12 of them had somehow escaped their coffins and were walking again. The last journal entry was dated the day before Holloway's death. It was written in a shaking hand, barely legible. They're coming for me. I can hear them at night, scratching at their coffins. The old ones especially, the ones who've been buried for years. They're stronger than they should be. The formula shouldn't allow for physical movement, but somehow they're breaking free. I've seen them in the woods, shambling figures that shouldn't be able to walk. They're looking for me. They want revenge. Abigail doesn't understand. She thinks I'm going mad, but I know what I've seen. The dead are waking, and they're angry. Tonight I'm going to barricade the house. If anything happens to me, if they get me, Abigail must destroy everything. The coffins, the journals, the formula. All of it must burn. But even as I write this, I know the truth, there is no escape. What I've done cannot be undone. The consciousness I've trapped cannot be freed except by destroying the bodies completely. And there are too many. Far too many. I've created my own hell, and now I must dwell in it for eternity. That was the last entry. The next day, Holloway was found dead in his barn, his throat cut from ear to ear. The official report said suicide, but now Hendricks knew better. The victims had killed him. Somehow, impossibly, they'd escaped their graves and taken revenge on their tormentor. And Mrs. Holloway? She'd kept the secret, tried to get rid of the evidence by selling the most recent coffins. But the victims had found her too. They'd killed her the same way, then started the fire to destroy the house and all evidence of what had been done. Hendricks closed the last journal and sat in silence. Outside, dawn was breaking over Ashford. He could hear the town waking up, shopkeepers opening their doors, horses on the streets, the normal sounds of life. But nothing felt normal anymore. He now knew that somewhere in the forest, 12 conscious corpses were wandering, possibly returning to the place they'd been tortured. And in the cemetery behind the burned Holloway property, dozens more might still be buried alive, trapped in an eternal nightmare. He had to go back. Had to confirm what the journals claimed. Had to face whatever horrors still lurked in that cursed place. But he wouldn't go alone. He'd need more men, more weapons, and more courage than he'd ever required before. Chapter 6: The Return. By mid-morning, Hendricks had gathered a larger posse, 12 armed men, to return to the Holloway property. Many were skeptical. The journals spoke of preserved consciousness and living corpses, which sounded like madness. But the empty coffins and wet footprints into the forest could not be denied. Samuel rode silently beside the sheriff, haunted by the faces of those he had seen, people buried alive, clawing at satin for years. If Holloway's formula truly kept them conscious, their suffering was unimaginable. The forest was no less menacing by daylight. Horses balked, ears pinned, nostrils flaring at invisible scents. The air felt thick, almost alive, and a sickly smell of decay and chemicals grew stronger as they approached the clearing. The Holloway property was a ruin. The house was blackened and smoking, the barn half collapsed. The cemetery still stood, and among the graves were 12 figures, motionless and watching. The missing bodies had returned. "They're walking," Hendricks whispered. The figures tracked their movements with hollow, aware eyes. Their bodies were grotesque, stiff, and partially decayed. Torn fingernails dangled from Robert Chen's hands, Margaret Sweeney's head tilted unnaturally. And yet, they were alive, or something close to it. "What do we do?" one deputy asked. "They're victims," Samuel said. "Holloway did this." "They killed Holloway," another muttered. "They were avenging themselves," Hendricks replied. "Can you blame them?" He dismounted and approached slowly. Samuel followed. Up close, the horror was worse. These were not mindless corpses but conscious beings, trapped in decaying bodies. From their throats came sounds, broken, almost human attempts at speech. Thomas Whitley stepped forward. "Help us," he rasped. "We want to help," Hendricks said. "Tell us what you need." "Others, still, trapped," Whitley croaked, gesturing to the graves. Samuel stared at the cemetery. "There are more." "Still alive down there?" Whitley nodded. "Years, decades, some, please." Hendricks didn't hesitate. "Bring shovels. Dig them up." Hours later, 43 coffins had been exhumed. Each held a body, some fresh, others skeletal, all preserved and aware. Eyes tracked their rescuers. Fingers twitched. Throats worked to form words. One had been buried in 1887, 31 years conscious in the dark, its coffin lid carved nearly through from decades of clawing. The sight broke hardened men. Deputies wept, retched, turned away. Even Hendricks could barely look. "What do we do?" Miller asked hollowly. "The journals say destroying the body frees the mind," Samuel answered. "Fire, maybe." Whitley stepped closer. "And us, please. You want to die?" Hendricks asked gently. "Yes, anything, to stop." The sheriff nodded. "We'll help you." They built a massive pyre in the clearing. Those who could walk climbed onto it willingly, those too decayed to move were carried. None resisted. All seemed desperate for release. As the sun dipped below the trees, Hendricks addressed them. "No one should suffer what you have. We're going to give you peace." One by one, the victims lay down on the pyre. Before the flames were lit, Whitley looked at Samuel and mouthed two words, "Thank you." Hendricks struck the torch himself. The fire roared to life, devouring the corpses. As it did, Samuel heard something that would haunt him forever, a single, collective sigh of relief from 43 voices as their torment finally ended. The pyre burned through the night, a beacon in the darkness. By dawn, only ashes and bone fragments remained. Whatever Holloway's formula had done, its curse was broken. The dead were finally at rest. Chapter 7, The Professor. 3 days after the burning, Samuel received a visitor at his funeral parlor. The man was elderly, perhaps 70, dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a leather case. He introduced himself as Dr. Cornelius Wade, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry from a university back east. But Samuel recognized the description from Holloway's journals. This was the professor, the man who'd given Holloway the formula. "I heard about the fire," Wade said, settling into a chair in Samuel's office. "About the bodies you found. I came as soon as I could." "You're the one who taught him," Samuel said, his voice cold. "You're responsible for all of this." Wade's face showed genuine remorse. "I am. And I've spent every day since regretting it. I never imagined he'd use the formula like this. I thought he wanted it for scientific purposes, for research. I didn't know he was a monster." "What is it?" "This formula." Wade opened his case and pulled out a journal, different from Holloway's, but filled with similar handwriting. "It's based on ancient alchemical texts I discovered in Prague in 1882. The alchemists called it the suspension, a state between life and death. They believed they could use it to achieve immortality, but they were wrong. The formula doesn't grant eternal life, it grants eternal consciousness in a dead body. The ultimate torture. How does it work? The chemicals interact with the nervous system at the moment of administration, essentially crystallizing the consciousness into the physical structure of the brain and nerve tissue. The body begins to die, metabolism stops, decay begins, but the consciousness remains trapped, aware. It's irreversible once the process completes. The only way to free the consciousness is to completely destroy the physical matter it's trapped in. Samuel felt sick. Why would anyone create such a thing? Because they didn't understand what they were creating. The medieval alchemists thought they were finding the secret to eternal life. They didn't realize they were creating eternal suffering. Wade closed his journal. "I've dedicated the last 15 years to finding an antidote, a way to reverse the process. But I've failed. The only mercy we can offer is fire." Holloway's journals mention dozens of victims. "We found 43 in his cemetery. Do you know if there are others? Other people he might have sold coffins to, other places he might have buried victims?" Wade's face paled. "I don't know. After I gave him the formula, I lost track of him. Moved away, tried to forget. But if he was selling coffins..." He stood suddenly, agitated. "We need to check. We need to make sure those 12 coffins you purchased were the only ones he sold." They spent the next week investigating. They found records in the town hall showing that Holloway had indeed sold coffins to other undertakers over the years, not many, but enough. 17 coffins sold to various funeral parlors across Arkansas and neighboring states over the past decade. Each sale recorded with the same meticulous detail Holloway brought to everything. Samuel and Hendricks sent telegrams to every town where coffins had been purchased, warning them to check for bodies, to look for signs of Holloway's work. The responses that came back were horrifying. 8 of the 17 coffins had been used for burials. 8 families had buried their loved ones in Holloway's creations, never knowing what they were putting them through. But these victims hadn't been subjected to the formula, they'd died naturally and been buried in normal coffins that just happened to be Holloway's work. When the coffins were exhumed and checked, they contained only normal corpses in appropriate states of decay. The nightmare was limited to Holloway's own property, to the victims he'd personally tortured. Still, Samuel couldn't shake the horror of it. 8 families had used coffins built by a serial killer, had laid their loved ones to rest in caskets identical to the ones used for torture. The psychological impact on those families, once they learned the truth, would be devastating. Wade remained in Ashford, helping with the investigation. He brought his own journals, showed them the formula, explained the chemistry. Hendricks wanted to arrest him as an accessory to murder, but ultimately decided against it. Wade's crime was one of ignorance and misplaced trust, not malice. And his knowledge was proving valuable in understanding what had happened. The formula requires specific components, Wade explained, showing them his notes. Several are common chemicals, but 3 are extremely rare. I gave Holloway enough for perhaps 20 applications, expecting him to use it for research on animal subjects. If he used it on 43 people, he must have found a way to synthesize it himself or acquired more from another source. They searched the ruins of Holloway's house and barn, looking for evidence of a laboratory or chemical storage. They found it in a hidden cellar beneath the barn, a small room lined with shelves containing dozens of bottles and jars. Wade examined them carefully and confirmed that Holloway had indeed been manufacturing the formula himself. There was enough raw material here for hundreds of applications. We need to destroy all of this, Wade said firmly. Burn it, bury it, make sure no one ever finds it. This knowledge is too dangerous to exist. They burned everything. The chemicals, the journals, the photographs, every scrap of evidence. They left only Hendricks's report in Wade's scholarly journal, kept under lock and key in the sheriff's office, as a record of what had happened. The formula itself was committed to memory by no one. Wade claimed he'd forgotten the exact proportions, and whether that was true or a lie, Samuel was grateful. The Holloway property was left to burn itself out completely. Over the following weeks, the forest seemed to reclaim it, growing over the ruins with unusual speed. Within 2 months, you could barely tell anything had ever stood there. The clearing was gone, swallowed by trees that seemed eager to hide the evidence of human evil. But Samuel never forgot. He dreamed about it, about Thomas Whitley's corpse asking for help, about 43 bodies burning on a pyre, about the scratches inside those coffin lids. He woke most nights in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear fingernails scraping on wood, voices whispering for help. He sold his funeral parlor 3 months later and moved to Little Rock. He couldn't stand to be in Ashford anymore, couldn't stand to work with coffins after what he'd seen. The new owner didn't know about the 12 coffins or what they'd contained. Samuel made sure of that. Some stories are better left buried. Chapter 8, The Legacy. 10 years passed. Samuel Pritchard had left the funeral trade behind and was now a clerk in Little Rock, married with 2 children. Yet the past never released him. Some nights he awoke certain he'd heard scratching in the walls. Coffins at funerals made him physically ill. The memories of Raven Creek refused to fade. Dr. Wade died in 1903, taking his knowledge with him. Sheriff Hendricks retired in 1905. The posse scattered, each man haunted by what they had seen. Then, in 1908, a letter shattered Samuel's fragile peace. It was from a lawyer in Memphis. Mrs. Martha Holloway, Abigail's sister, had died and inexplicably left her estate to him, including a sealed box meant for his eyes only. Inside was Abigail's private journal. In it, She confessed to being a full partner in her husband's crimes, selecting victims, administering the formula, orchestrating the suffering. But one revelation chilled Samuel most: the formula hadn't been lost. Abigail had made copies and hidden them across Arkansas. 12 caches, each containing chemicals and instructions, buried in remote locations. And she had shared this secret with one person, her nephew, Thomas Holloway Jr., a young chemistry student in Boston who believed the formula could be refined to grant consciousness beyond death. He called it immortality. Authorities searched after Samuel, alerted Hendricks. Thomas Jr. had vanished in 1902. 3 caches were found and destroyed, but 9 were missing, likely already in his possession. Reports soon surfaced. In 1912, 7 travelers vanished in New Orleans. A local undertaker purchased 7 mahogany coffins from a man matching Thomas Jr.'s description. The shop burned down. The undertaker was gone. On the charred door, carved in shaky letters, were the words, "Still awake. Help US." It began again. Over the next decade, disappearances linked to coffin purchases and unexplained fires were reported in at least 6 cities. Authorities were always too late. Thomas Jr. was cautious, constantly moving, burning evidence and changing identities. Samuel spent his remaining years tracking rumors, warning law enforcement, and searching for signs of the formula's use. But he never found the man. Samuel died in 1925 of a heart attack at 63. His final words to his wife were chilling: "I can hear them scratching. All of them. Still scratching." His family dismissed it as delirium. But Samuel knew the truth. Somewhere, in forgotten basements and sealed warehouses, victims remained trapped, conscious, screaming silently, clawing at the darkness. And if you listen closely, in certain abandoned funeral parlors or burned-out buildings, you might still hear it, the faint, desperate sound of fingernails scraping wood. The nightmare never ended. It only changed hands. The end.